There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a city when it starts losing itself. Not the silence of emptiness exactly. Los Angeles is still loud. The freeways are still clogged at 6 in the morning. The palm trees still sway against a sky that on the right evening turns the color of something you can't quite name. But there's another silence underneath all of that. The silence of things that used to be there and aren't anymore. The silence of a business that's been there for 20 years and then, one Tuesday, isn't. The silence of a neighborhood where the people who built it can no longer afford to live in it. The silence of an industry that once made the whole world dream of one particular city and is now slowly, quietly, relocating somewhere else. Los Angeles has always been a city of arrivals. People came here because they heard something was possible here that wasn't possible anywhere else. That feeling, that sense of arrival, of potential, of standing somewhere that mattered, was always part of what the city sold. And for a long time, the city delivered on the promise. But spend enough time talking to the people who have lived here for decades, or looking at the data that tracks what has actually happened to this city over the past several years, and a different picture comes into focus. A picture of something slipping away faster than most people realize, not in dramatic headlines, not in the kind of collapse you can point to on a single date, but in the accumulation of small disappearances. The closed restaurant, the empty tower, the family that finally packed up and moved to Las Vegas, the production crew that filmed in Georgia instead. Each one, on its own, feels like a footnote. Together, they start to feel like a chapter. In today's video, we're looking at 12 things disappearing from Los Angeles faster than most people realize. Some of them you'll recognize immediately. Some of them you may not have noticed yet, but by the time we're done, you'll see them everywhere. Let's start with number 12. Number 12 is something most people drive past every day without stopping to consider what it means. It's the empty storefront. Not one or two. Dozens. In some stretches of downtown Los Angeles, more than 1 out of every 3 commercial spaces sits vacant. According to research by real estate firm Avison Young, the historic core, once the rip-roaring heart of the city's shopping and entertainment district, now has more than 100 vacant storefronts. The Art Deco buildings are still there. The ornate theater marquees are still there. But behind them and around them, windows are boarded up. Spaces that once had restaurants, boutiques, small service businesses. Now they have plywood and handwritten signs from a landlord somewhere explaining that a new tenant is being sought. The reasons for this are layered. Remote work changed the math of downtown entirely. When office workers stopped commuting 5 days a week, the lunch crowds disappeared. The after-work crowds disappeared. The foot traffic that a small restaurant or a dry cleaner or a shoe repair shop depends on, gone, or reduced to a fraction of what it was. And then the math got worse. Rent stayed high even as customers stayed away. Labor costs went up. And for many small business owners who had survived the worst of the pandemic by taking on debt, that debt came due. The ones who couldn't make it work closed. The landlords who couldn't find new tenants defaulted on their own loans. The abandoned Oceanwide Plaza Tower, a 677-foot skyscraper that was supposed to become a luxury mixed-use development, sits unfinished in the heart of downtown. Its outer walls covered in graffiti, a monument to the kind of confidence that no longer quite fits the city it was supposed to crown. The office vacancy rate in downtown Los Angeles hit nearly 34% by early 2025, according to CBRE, a number that experts describe as roughly triple what a healthy market should look like. But it's not just a number. It's the reason the sidewalks feel different than they used to. It's the reason some parts of downtown feel, to longtime residents, like they're visiting a version of the city they don't quite recognize. Number 11 is the disappearance of the working-class neighborhood. Not in the abstract. In specific places, In Boyle Heights, a community on the east side of Los Angeles where generations of Mexican-American families built something that was entirely their own, the change is visible and documented. Art galleries, expensive coffee shops, and luxury apartment complexes have moved into a neighborhood that was for decades affordable precisely because larger economic forces had ignored it. The UCLA Urban Displacement Project has categorized parts of Boyle Heights as at risk of becoming exclusive, meaning that housing costs are rising so fast that the low-income households who shaped the community are being forced out. Families who lived there for 20, 30, 40 years. People who started small businesses there. People whose children grew up there. Gone, or in the process of going. Eagle Rock went through a similar transformation. So did Highland Park, where the storefronts on Figueroa Street that once served the longtime Latino community have steadily been replaced by the kind of businesses: artisanal coffee, vintage clothing, small plate restaurants with carefully sourced ingredients that appeal to newcomers with different incomes and different expectations. The longtime residents who made those neighborhoods what they were didn't disappear voluntarily. They were priced out, and the city they built, the culture they built, went with them. This isn't a story about whether change is good or bad. It's a story about who a city is for and what happens to the people who built it when they can no longer afford to live there. In Los Angeles right now, that question has no comfortable answer. Number 10 is a loss that goes deeper than economics. Though economics is certainly at the root of it, the middle-class neighborhood itself, as a functioning stable reality for ordinary working families, is vanishing from Los Angeles faster than almost anywhere else in the country. The numbers are stark. According to data from late 2024, only 1.6% of middle-income families in the Los Angeles metro area could afford to buy a home. 3 years before that, the number was 9.9%. That is not a gradual decline. That is a free fall. The median home price in Los Angeles hit $970,000. The average rent for an apartment was around $2,974 a month. A family earning $80,000 to $100,000 a year, solidly middle class by any reasonable definition, would need to spend far beyond the federally recommended 30% of their income just to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. What that means, in human terms, is that a huge swath of ordinary Angelinos, nurses, teachers, firefighters, city workers, people who make the city function, cannot afford to own a home here. Many of them are finding it increasingly difficult to rent one either. And the city has barely been building. In 2025, Los Angeles issued just 8,614 residential building permits, one of the lowest figures in a decade. By comparison, cities like Austin, Texas, approve new housing at dramatically higher rates, and rents there have actually fallen over the past several years. In Los Angeles, rents increased 28% since March 2020. The gap between what ordinary people earn and what it costs to live here has reached the point where the middle class itself is becoming something this city can no longer sustainably support. And that, in the long arc of what makes a city function and feel like itself, may be the most consequential disappearance of all. Number 9 is something Los Angeles built its entire modern identity on, and it is leaving. Not all at once, not in a way that feels final yet, but steadily and in ways that people who work in it describe with a kind of grief. Hollywood, the film and television industry, the thing that made Los Angeles mean something to the entire world. It's losing ground in a way that nobody in the city's recent history would have predicted. The numbers are almost hard to comprehend if you grew up thinking of Los Angeles and the entertainment industry as synonymous. According to Film LA, the official film office for the city and county, production measured in Los Angeles shoot days fell from 36,692 in 2022 to just 19,694 in 2025. That's nearly a 50% decline in 3 years. The number of film and television industry workers in Los Angeles County dropped from about 142,000 in 2022 to roughly 100,000 by the end of 2024. That's 42,000 jobs, In 2 years, the average number of film and TV production jobs in California in the first quarter of 2025 was 92,000, down 35% from 2022 and nearly 20% below where it was a decade ago. Stage occupancy in the region, which held steady between 93 and 95% annually from 2018 to 2021, fell to 63% in 2024. Productions are leaving for places that offer better tax incentives. Georgia, New Mexico, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Canada. They are finding locations that cost less, labor pools that are growing, and infrastructure that has been built specifically to attract work that used to default to Los Angeles. In the first quarter of 2025, only 24 of the 87 scripted film and television projects produced in the United States filmed at least partly in Los Angeles. Nearly half of all titles began production entirely outside the country. The Wall Street Journal compared what is happening to Hollywood to what happened to Detroit when the auto industry collapsed. That comparison may be dramatic, but the people who work in the industry, the sound mixers, the set builders, the costume designers, the animators, are not speaking in dramatic terms. They're speaking in quiet, exhausted ones. They're talking about not finding work, about leaving the industry they spent their lives building, about not knowing what comes next. Governor Gavin Newsom described the state of the industry as being on life support. The actor Noah Weil, testifying at a congressional field hearing in Burbank, called it a near cratering of our once thriving industry. California raised its annual film and TV tax credits to $750 million for 2024 to 2025, and some indie projects returned. But analysts are warning that many jobs may never come back and that the global decentralization of production may be permanent. Los Angeles was the place where the world went to make movies and television. That identity is not gone, but it is unmistakably diminishing. Number 8 is the local restaurant that has been there for decades and then, one day, posts a sign. Sometimes the sign is hand-lettered. Sometimes it's a brief statement on Instagram that begins, "It is with heavy hearts." Sometimes there's no sign at all, and you just notice, driving past, that the lights are off and the chairs are stacked. In 2025, more than 100 notable Los Angeles restaurants closed their doors. Some were institutions, Father's Office, a gastropub in the Arts District that had been a fixture for 24 years. Elf Cafe in Echo Park, gone after 2 decades. Akasha in Hollywood, closed after 18 years, citing economic constraints and rising costs. Here's Looking at You in Koreatown, one of the most celebrated restaurants in the city, shuttered after nearly a decade. Guerrilla Tacos, one of the city's most influential taquerias, closed in early 2025 after years of the pandemic's lingering financial damage. Since COVID, things have been extremely strained, the managing partner said in a video posted online. As the years passed and we had hoped that things were going to get better, they simply have not. The closures cut across every category: Michelin-starred restaurants, mom-and-pop operations, beloved neighborhood spots. The reasons were consistent: inflation on ingredients, rent that kept rising even when customers didn't come back in the numbers that were needed, labor costs that had increased dramatically, and the persistent shadow of debt that many businesses had taken on during the pandemic and were now paying back in a market that had not fully recovered. And then the wildfires came in January 2025. And for businesses already on the edge, the combination of displaced customers, disrupted supply chains, and a city collectively in shock was often the final blow. A city's restaurants are more than places to eat. They are where people celebrate, where communities gather, where a neighborhood announces what it is. When they close, something leaves with them that doesn't easily come back. Number 7 is the middle-class homeowner's relationship with long-term stability, and specifically, the way that the January 2025 wildfires revealed just how precarious that relationship had already become. The Palisades Fire and the Eaton Fire both igniting on January 7, 2025, driven by Santa Ana winds reaching up to 100 miles per hour, destroyed more than 16,000 homes, businesses, and other structures. 31 people died. More than 180,000 people were forced to evacuate. The Palisades fire alone burned through the Pacific Palisades neighborhood, destroying 6,137 structures. The Eaton fire burned through Altadena, destroying 9,514 structures and killing 18 people. Altadena was particularly significant because of what it represented. It was one of the last predominantly middle-class communities in the greater Los Angeles area, where Black families had been able to build multi-generational wealth through homeownership. Danielle Neal, a fourth-generation Altadena resident, watched the house she grew up in and the home she was renting both burn down. Her aunt and uncle, who lived in the family home, were immediately deluged by people looking to purchase the still smoldering ruins at steep discounts. Within days of the fire, reports of price gouging were widespread. One home in Santa Monica that had been listed at $14,000 a month before the fires was relisted at $28,000. With multiple applications already in, the state had laws limiting rent increases during declared emergencies. The laws were not always followed. For the thousands of ordinary families who lost homes in the fires, the prospect of rebuilding in Los Angeles, in an insurance market that had already been in crisis before the fires, in a housing market where construction costs were among the highest in the country, was not a straightforward path. Many were facing the realistic possibility that they simply could not afford to come back, that communities that had existed for generations could simply cease to exist as affordable, accessible places to live. The fires didn't create that vulnerability. They exposed it. Number 6 is the city's long and complicated relationship with its own downtown, and specifically, the slow collapse of the vision that downtown Los Angeles would become in the 21st century. What downtowns in other great American cities had always been. That vision never fully arrived, and now it is receding. The story of downtown Los Angeles office space is a story of numbers that tell you more than any individual building can. The office vacancy rate in the downtown core was 15.3% at the start of 2020. By the second quarter of 2025, it had risen to a historic high of 22%, with overall availability, including space that is leased but not actually occupied, reaching nearly 34%. According to CBRE, the average market sale price for office space fell 27% over the same period. Major landlords defaulted on their loans. The gas company Tower, which in 2020 was valued at $632 million, was sold at foreclosure to Los Angeles County in 2024 for $200 million. The Wells Fargo Center Towers, signature buildings in the downtown skyline, saw their landlords in financial distress. The abandoned Oceanwide Plaza Tower, 677 feet of unfinished ambition, became a symbol of what happens when confidence and capital get ahead of reality. What's been lost is not just the financial value, it's the street life, the pedestrian traffic, the sense that downtown Los Angeles was becoming a place where people actually lived and worked and gathered, rather than a place you passed through on your way somewhere else. The drop in foot traffic, once office workers stopped commuting 5 days a week, drained the small businesses that served them, which in turn made downtown feel less like a destination, which made it harder to attract new residents and tenants, which drove vacancies higher. It is the kind of cycle that is very easy to start and very hard to stop. Number 5 is quieter than some of the others, and it's the one that longtime residents tend to describe with the most personal pain. It's the loss of the local anchor, the business that has been on the same corner for so long that it stopped being a business and became a landmark, a reference point, something that told you where you were and who you were, something that meant the neighborhood was still itself. These anchors have been disappearing from Los Angeles at an accelerating rate. Sweet Lady Jane, the beloved bakery that had been a fixture in West Hollywood and beyond for more than 3 decades. Café Tropical in Silver Lake, the Cuban bakery that had been feeding the neighborhood for years before its owner closed all of his businesses at once without explanation, suggesting the problem went far beyond any single location. Suehiro Cafe in Little Tokyo, a family-run Japanese diner that had served the community for generations, evicted by its landlord after decades of operation. The Globe Theater, which had a full schedule of events abruptly canceled due to a landlord dispute. One by one, the anchors lift. And when they go, something leaves the neighborhood that isn't replaced by whatever arrives in its place. Because what arrives is usually something with no memory of the place, no roots, no sense of what was there before. There's a particular quality to the loss of a neighborhood institution. It's not just that the food was good or the service was kind. It's that those places held a kind of institutional memory. The regular customers knew each other. The owner knew the regulars. People went there for milestones, birthdays, first dates, the meal after a hard day, the coffee before a difficult conversation. When those places close, the community that formed around them doesn't automatically reconstitute somewhere else. Often, it just disperses. Number 4 is something that runs beneath all the other things we've been talking about, and it's the loss that's hardest to see clearly until you're looking at it from outside. It's the population itself, the people. Los Angeles County recorded the largest population decline of any county in the United States between July 2024 and July 2025. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, roughly 54,000 residents left the county during that one-year period. The county, which had more than 10 million residents as recently as 2020, had fallen to roughly 9.7 million. And the people leaving were not just wealthy residents who could afford to go anywhere. They were middle-class families, young adults who had grown up here and couldn't afford to stay, retirees who had watched the city they loved become financially unmanageable, people who described to anyone who would listen a sense of exhaustion, of paying more and more and getting less and less in return, of watching services decline while costs climbed, of feeling like the city was no longer on their side. They were moving to Las Vegas, which gained more than 20,000 new residents in the same period, to Phoenix, to Austin, to smaller cities in Idaho, Arizona, and Florida where a dollar went further and a family could actually buy a house. And the places they went were growing precisely because Los Angeles, and California more broadly, was losing the people who make a city function. The teachers and nurses and electricians and small business owners who are the connective tissue of any community. A University of California, Berkeley study found that Californians who left between 2016 and 2025 relocated to neighborhoods where monthly housing costs were, on average, $672 less. They weren't fleeing California because they wanted to. They were leaving because the math had stopped working. What makes this particular kind of population loss so significant is the second part of it, the part that's less visible. It's not just that people are leaving. Fewer people are coming in to replace them. The immigration flows that historically kept Los Angeles young and economically dynamic have slowed. The young professionals who once moved to Los Angeles to break into the entertainment industry or start companies are doing those things in other cities now. The city is losing the future as well as the present. Number 3. This one sits close to the bone for many Angelenos because it's about something that was supposed to be safe, something that was supposed to be the foundation everything else was built on. It's the loss of what you might call the earned stability. The feeling that if you worked hard and saved carefully and made reasonable choices, the city would hold you. That it would be possible, over the course of a life, to put down roots here. For a significant portion of the people who live in Los Angeles, that feeling is gone. It's not pessimism. It's arithmetic. A teacher at a Los Angeles public school earning $65,000 a year cannot buy a home here. A firefighter, a paramedic, a social worker. These are not people who chose the wrong career or made poor financial decisions. These are people who showed up to do essential work. And the city they showed up to do it in has made it economically impossible for them to build a life here on a long-term basis. When only 1.6% of middle-income households can afford to buy a home, when that number was nearly 10% just 3 years earlier. What you're seeing is the functional elimination of home ownership as a realistic aspiration for a large portion of the population. This matters beyond the personal. Cities need a resident base that has long-term stakes in the place. People who own homes, who have children in schools, who are invested in what happens to the neighborhood in 20 years. When those people can't afford to stay, they leave. And the city loses not just their presence but their participation, their votes, their volunteer hours, their institutional knowledge, their sense of belonging that makes a community feel like one. Los Angeles is, in this sense, not just losing people. It is losing the deep roots that hold a city in place when the hard times come. Number 2. What is disappearing here is something that cannot be charted directly, but that shapes everything else. Call it the city's sense of itself, the story that Los Angeles told about itself, and that the rest of the world believed, for most of the 20th century, was a story of possibility. You could come here with nothing and become something. The weather was extraordinary. The opportunities were real. The place was alive with people who had taken a bet on the future and were in the process of winning it. That story was never entirely true for everyone. Los Angeles has always had deep inequalities and profound injustices running alongside its celebrated freedoms. But the story had enough truth in it that it shaped the city's character, its energy, its particular way of moving through the world. That story is being rewritten right now, in ways that are uncomfortable and unresolved. The places that gave the story its texture, the working-class neighborhoods where immigrants built new lives, the mid-century restaurants where deals were made and dreams were talked about, the independent theaters and music venues and small galleries where the city's creative life found expression, are closing or changing or becoming too expensive for the people who made them what they were. The Doors famously photographed their iconic 1970 album cover at the Morrison Hotel on South Hope Street in downtown Los Angeles. That hotel, one of the city's most historically resonant landmarks, now sits boarded up. There are more than 100 vacant storefronts around it in the historic core. The neighborhood that once represented the gritty, democratic, anything possible heart of the city looks, in too many places, like a city in retreat from itself. None of this is inevitable. Cities have come back from worse, but coming back requires acknowledging what is actually happening, not what the promotional version of the story says, not what the real estate listings suggest, but what the people who actually live here experience on an ordinary day. The people working 2 jobs and still unable to afford rent. The business owners watching their margins evaporate. The film industry workers who logged fewer days on set in 2024 than at any point in memory. The families in Altadena, sifting through the ash of homes that had been in the family for generations. These are not peripheral stories. They are the central story of what Los Angeles is going through right now. And number 1, this is the thing disappearing from Los Angeles that, if it goes completely, changes the nature of the place in a way that nothing else can restore. It's the conviction that the city is worth staying in, worth investing in, worth building a life in, worth dreaming inside of. That conviction is not gone. There are still people here who feel it deeply. People who love this city with a ferocity that can surprise you, who point to everything that is still extraordinary about it. The food, the weather, the creativity that still sparks in neighborhoods across the county, the communities that are still fighting for the version of Los Angeles they believe in. But the number of people who feel that conviction is shrinking, and the pace at which it's shrinking has accelerated. When a city loses the people who believe in it, when the ones who would have stayed, who would have opened the restaurant or the small business or bought the modest house and raised children in the public schools, when those people leave, they take something with them that does not easily regenerate. They take the lived investment in a place, The willingness to stick around through the hard parts because you believe the hard parts are temporary and what you're building is worth it. That belief is what allows a city to renew itself from the inside rather than simply being transformed from the outside by forces it cannot control or slow. The 2028 Olympics are coming to Los Angeles. The city is building new transit lines and converting empty office towers into apartments and trying, in various ways, to tell a story about what comes next. Some of those things are genuinely promising. Some of them may help. But the question that haunts every one of those efforts is whether the people they are meant to serve will still be there when they arrive. Whether the families who needed affordable housing in 2020 will have waited. Whether the workers who needed a functioning middle class will have found another city more willing to provide one. Whether the conviction that Los Angeles is worth staying in can be rebuilt fast enough to matter. Cities are always changing. That has always been true, and it is true here too. But some changes are surface. New buildings, new faces, new fashions. And some changes go all the way down to the foundation. What is happening in Los Angeles right now is not surface change. It is the kind of change that reaches into the stories people tell about who they are and where they belong. The kind of change that, when enough of it accumulates, means that the people who come back to a neighborhood they grew up in don't quite recognize it. Not because it looks different, because it feels different. Because the things that made it theirs are gone. That's the most honest way to describe what 12 items on a list can only gesture toward. Not a city collapsing, not a city dying. A city quietly, rapidly losing the things that made it what it was. And the people who understood that best are, in many cases, the ones who have already left. If these are the signs disappearing from Los Angeles today, the next question may be the one that matters most. It starts with the storefront.
But the pattern is repeating itself in cities across the country. We just move somewhere else and hope for the best.